Okay, great questions here. One question asks, I don't know what the shroud shows, but I've read that the nails through the palms would have ripped through the fingers, that the nails would have had to pass through the wrist, where bone and ligament would have held this weight. We'll look at this more next week. We don't know exactly. The shroud shows the wound coming out here, I believe. And so some people interpret that as going right through here like that. And that's kind of disconcerting because Christian art always shows the wounds in the middle of the palm. But another hypothesis that recent doctors have proposed is that, well, what the shroud shows coming out here could also come through like this. And either way, the point is that the nail goes right through the bones of the wrist that locks it, so that you wouldn't, because the Romans are experts. They're not going to nail somebody in such a way that the hand could split and you could fall from the cross. So by putting it through the bones of the wrist, it locks it in place. Right. And so that could be like, we'll look at this next week, but one way to understand it is like this. Do you have an opinion on that? Right. Right. So it wouldn't go through. It wouldn't go through like this, because if it went through like this, it could just tear, and you could fall. Right. Right. So it has to. Yeah, exactly. I need a pen or something. Yeah. It's going through like this. Is that we have a doctor here?
Well, I don't know. I see in articles maybe they thought it was actually right through the wrist.
Right. That could be too. Right. Right. Either way that you have it, if it goes through the wrist, it'll hold you. Right. Whether it goes through like this or like this. I just, as an artist, the whole iconography has it go through here, but it must come out here, and so that could be. Well, I've got a slide of that in the computer afterwards. Bill?
Why do you suppose if all the art was so influenced by the face on the image, why wouldn't they be influenced by the hands?
Apparently, well, we'll talk about it next time. Apparently that wasn't known. The way that the shroud was folded, it seems that it was the face that was known more than and not the rest. But again, that's part of the history of the early history of the shroud. Do you have any knowledge about that?
Some of in the burial, when they used the herbs and spices, there's also indications on the shroud that there were flowers placed on the fabric.
Right.
And so they obscure or occlude some of the look at the wounds. You know, they kind of they're superimposed on each other and they're not clear.
Yeah, we can talk more about that next time. Okay, but in any case, the suffering would have been extreme because it would go through the most sensitive nerves. Okay, but it also would hold you up. The extent. A question regards the extent and time of Christ's interior suffering. Would this have been his whole life, or would it have just been the time of the Passion? And I think we should say that it would have been his whole life, but with a special intensity in the time of the Passion. And so he would have wanted to carry this to atone more during his life. And the same thing would go of his mother. That we see that perhaps more clearly, that St. Simeon reveals to Mary that a sword will pierce your heart when Jesus is a 40-year-old baby, 40-day-old baby. And so clearly that was revealed so that her whole maternity could be a preparation for her being at the foot of the cross, could be an atonement, could be a participation in reparation. Well, if that's true of Mary, well, it would have been more true of her son, of Jesus, no? We should think. But nevertheless, it was only, there's a time for everything, so it would have been the time to sweat blood, to take the full interior desolation, that the time for that would have been Gethsemane, the Passion. Now, what about afterwards? Because still today, he has the vision, and he knows in the vision all human sin, just as he did in Gethsemane. Why should we think that he's suffering now? And that's another question here. Can Christ still suffer? Does he still suffer when we sin? So we should say here that it's not necessary. There's a time for all things. His body is glorified. There's not a time for that interior desolation anymore, because our redemption is accomplished. And that's indicated in Jesus' words. It is fulfilled. Right? It's done. It's done with his death. And so he doesn't need to atone more today. Right? So we shouldn't think that. Obviously, the reason for it is still there, the sins of the world. But the time for his emotional desolation was then. So does he still suffer today? Can he still suffer? And it would seem, so another question asks, in Christ's appearance to St. Margaret Mary, he says that he still suffers simply from the ingratitude, even more than his passion. That's right. But the best way to interpret this, I think, is that precisely through the vision, he saw all the ingratitude that we do today. He saw that then, because that was the time of the suffering. And so it was then that he suffered for what we do today. But he needed consolation then. And so we could think that he could also be consoled by our fidelity. Because he doesn't need consolation anymore from us. But he did then. And so we can think that we can participate in that way. And it's real. And this, by the way, is something that the popes have written. Pius XI writes about this in his encyclical on the Sacred Heart. And so this is magisterium of the Church, that our infidelity today hurt him then, and our fidelities consoled him then. All right? So we shouldn't think that right now we're making him suffer, because the time of the atonement was then. But what we're doing now made him suffer then. All right? Does that make sense, everyone? Okay.
So, I can't think of a specific right now, but in many of the apparitions of Mary where she speaks about the suffering of her son or the anger of her son or the sin of the world, you have to understand that as talking about the sin of the world that's causing the suffering back then.
Right. The sin is now. It's very much now. But the time of the atonement was then.
So if we stop sinning now, then he's consoled even more so back then.
That's right. Right. And obviously, he's not in time now, Jesus, in the vision of God, in glory. But then he was. But it comes down to the same, right? Our suffering, the sin of the world and the sin of us in particular, is the cause of Christ's suffering. And it makes, so Mary, when Mary appears, very often she's weeping. There's in Akita in Japan recently, she wept blood in this statue in Japan, an approved apparition. And so what should we think about that? That she's weeping now? Well, again, I would explain it in the same way, that it's something objective, the sin of the world, and it objectively causes. It is such as to cause a mother to weep blood. Right? That's how we should understand it. Not that she's in a state in which she can weep blood today. Okay. Another question. Luke says in the beginning of his gospel that, I think it's chapter 2, that Jesus grew in wisdom and grace before God and men. And how is that compatible? How is learning compatible with him having the vision of God from the beginning? This is a very difficult question. We're going to talk more about this in the future when we do a talk on Jesus' knowledge. So we'll come back to it. But since the person's asking, it won't be here then. just briefly, Jesus has 3 kinds of knowledge in his human soul. And this is hard, we can't imagine this because we don't. Jesus had, like us, acquired knowledge through human experience and human reasoning and all just as we do. And that grows with experience. We get wiser as we grow older. We've seen more of the world, etc. And Jesus had that too. And so he really grew through that experiential knowledge, which is proper to man. But then he would have had, in addition to that, he would have had all the infused knowledge that is given in part to the saints. So if the Curé of Ars is given the gift of reading hearts, well, Jesus had it more. If the prophets are given, like Isaiah, to know the Passion, well, obviously Jesus would have known it more, etc., through infused knowledge. So he would have had this wealth of infused knowledge, but it's a different kind of knowledge than experiential. It's not. It doesn't have. It's different. I can't speak about it because I don't know by experience what it's like. So we can just grope.
No quantum physics.
Right.
Okay.
So he would have had that infused knowledge proper to the prophets and saints, and then in addition the vision, which is proper to the blessed. And so in some way it's beautiful. It makes him, he was like a microcosm. He had, and that makes sense because, he's the Lord. He had in him the kind of knowledge that's proper to human beings, acquired knowledge that grew, the knowledge proper really to angels, which is infused knowledge, which is given to the saints and the prophets in part, and the knowledge proper to the blessed in heaven, which is the vision. And so he had all of those when he walked the earth, because he's the Lord, because he's the revealer of the Father, because of his mission to redeem mankind and to reveal all the secrets of revelation to mankind. But he still grew in wisdom because in acquired knowledge. All right. Should we pray for a dark night of the soul or for abandonment? And the answer is no. And the reason is simple. Because there could be some presumption on our part, thinking that, we're advanced in the spiritual life and he'll send it to us when we're ready. And the key thing is to get ready, but we don't have to ask for the abandonment. And in fact, we shouldn't. St. Ignatius is the great master here of consolation and desolation. We call it discernment of spirits. St. Ignatius of Loyola, the author of the Spiritual Exercises. And St. Ignatius of Loyola explains that God sends desolation, and for there can be various reasons why he does so. And he sends consolations. And in the desolations, who's at work, though? Even though God permits it, it's the devil at work in the desolation. That's what we're experiencing. We're experiencing something of his restless emptiness. And so we don't want to ask for that. We want to ask for consolation. But not sensible consolation. In other words, we don't want to ask for sensible consolation so that we feel good. That's not what we ask for. We ask for spiritual consolation, which is the joy in the Spirit, the fruits. That's the way Paul presents it. The fruits of the Spirit are these: joy, peace, all of these beautiful fruits that are consolation in the higher sense. Not a sensible consolation, but a higher. That's what we can pray for always. So we don't pray for abandonment. But he'll send abandonment if we correspond to grace, because it's good for us at particular stages of the spiritual life. And again, it depends on our mission.
Should we pray for crosses, but like really little ones?
It's okay to pray for crosses, but you have to be careful. You have to be careful. Why? Because he sends them right away. He's very generous with crosses, because in reality they're what we need. But you have to be careful of being presumptuous. And so it's fine to pray for to send us what's good for us, and leave it to him to sort it out. Okay. Another question. Is the abandonment of Christ like the taking away of the graces of Pharaoh and the hardening of the heart? So no, right? It's not like that. So that the hardening of the heart of Pharaoh, the taking away of graces, is taking away of good things that are basically taking away love, taking away the things. In the hardening of the heart, what happens is, because somebody is resisting grace, culpably, obstinately, over and over again, it's just, God doesn't have to, but it's just that God diminish the flow of actual graces that help a person to convert. Why? Because the person's abused the ones that have been sent him. And so when God hardens the heart, what that means is He allows the person's obstinacy to lessen the flow of graces. That means that the person is less and less sanctified, but it's his own fault. Obviously, that's the opposite of what's happening, say, in the saints in the dark night. It's not that God is lessening the graces to them. It's quite the contrary. God is increasing the graces to them in a very superabundant way. That's the purpose of the dark nights. There are times of transition in the spiritual life in which you go from one age of the spiritual life to another age. Usually the spiritual authors speak of 3 ages in the spiritual life. The first age is what most of us are in and will stay in for our Christian lives, because we're not properly corresponding. And that's called the purgative stage. And that's the stage in which you're trying to pull up the vices. And it's like, if you have a garden, what's the first thing you have to do? Pull up the weeds. And as long as there are weeds there, you're going to have to be pulling up the weeds. And so most of us stay there. But that's our fault. It's not God's fault. Right? God would like us all to get to the unitive stage. But anyway, most of us stay in the purgative stage. But there's the next stage is called the illuminative stage, the stage of the more advanced who are progressing in virtue. In other words, their task in the second age is not so much to pull up the weeds, but to plant the seeds and water it. And so that's planting virtues and watering them, trying to acquire the good virtues. And there's a transition there, and that's the first night, the night of the soul. But then the second age needs to be transformed into the third age, which is the unitive age, the age of union with God, which is the age in which the saints get to, and the rest of us don't. And that is the transition that's the most painful. That's the dark night of the Spirit. So it's a time of great growth, of great graces, but the graces that are operating in darkness. Right? This is the way John of the Cross explains it. They're operating in darkness because that's what's good for the person, to teach them greater generosity, greater self-abnegation. And so it's a time of great increase in grace. So it's the exact opposite of the hardening of the heart in reality. But it might not seem so different to the person experiencing it. Right? The person experiencing it thinks precisely that. The person experiencing it thinks they're like Pharaoh, like they're being unfaithful to God. They're the worst person on earth, they say. And it's good for them because they're growing in humility through that. But it's the exact opposite of the truth. Yeah. Okay. Another question. Why is suffering the redeeming factor? Is it because it has to be an atonement, as in the breaking of a covenant curse? Great question. And this is difficult. Now, there are different views on this, no? In Catholic theology that are open to discussion. But the way I see it, suffering is the redeeming factor principally because it's the test of true love. True love is tested by what you'll endure for love. Sacrificial love. In other words, sacrifice shows the truth of love. That you love so much that you'll be faithful despite, right? That's what the martyrs show, no? The martyrdom is glorious because the fortitude showed by the martyr in being faithful despite the pain, despite the torture, shows the extent of their charity. And that's why a martyr is canonized on the evidence of the martyrdom, because sanctity consists in charity. Right? That's what sanctity is love for God and neighbor. And that you're willing to go through the greatest, most excruciating pains to be faithful to God shows that you love God above all things in a heroic way. And so that would be the principal element, I think, in Jesus' suffering. So the suffering is in service of the charity, but it's really the charity That's what most redeems. It's the charity that gives to God something more pleasing than all sin is displeasing. Right? Because that's what the atonement, that's the way St. Thomas Aquinas speaks about the atonement. That Christ gave to God something more pleasing than all human sin put together is displeasing. Well, what's the more pleasing thing? Suffering? No. Love. That's what's more pleasing. But love to such an extent that one is willing to suffer everything that a human being can suffer. Right? So that would be the principle I would explain. But secondly, suffering also does enter formally, I think, because it has to do with justice. In hell, why do they suffer in hell? Because if you've deprived someone of some good to get some satisfaction, what's a fitting penalty? That you be deprived of the good that you were willing to deprive your neighbor. In other words, the penalty for sin has to be suffering, because in the order of justice, so that the person tastes what the sin was. Right? Because the problem with sin is people wanting something for myself, I'm willing to let somebody else suffer, or I even inflict it directly, not thinking about what they're experiencing, not recognizing that we're both equally made in God's image, that we're both equally human beings. No? And so the penalty for sin is suffering what sin causes in your neighbor, suffering yourself. So in that sense, suffering is the natural penalty for sin. And so Christ too wanted to take on the natural penalty for all sin. No, that's what we said in the course of the talk, that he wanted to taste every kind of suffering to atone for all the different kinds of sins. In other words, to taste what sin deprives your neighbor of. He wanted to taste that all himself in reparation for sin. So I'd say both things. Does that make sense? Uh-huh.
That's a caveat whereby you wouldn't suffer the pain by following the novena.
Right.
So that would be
right, and sure, of course, that's for example, and even simply an indulgence does that, though, right? In other words, an indulgence takes away the temporal punishment for sin that we would have incurred in purgatory. And so, yes, of course, that penalty can be taken away by the mercy of God. Absolutely, it can. But Christ didn't want it taken away from himself, because he wanted to show us another thing. In other words, part of the purpose of the Passion was to show us what sin is and what it does. And so that his suffering shows us that more than anything else could, what sin is and what it does. Right? So for that sense, the suffering, I think, was in itself. But nevertheless, it's the love that's the principal thing, because that's what motivated him wanting to show us what sin is. Okay. Moses' seat was still there in Matthew 23. Right? Jesus said, "Do what those who sit, the Pharisees sit in the seat of scribes and Pharisees sit in the seat of Moses. Do what they say, but not what they do." So Moses' seat was still there in Matthew 23. The question is why the Protestants believe that the authority that was in Moses' seat went to the Bible instead of Christ's church, which he founded. Is this sins of the Sanhedrin at the basis of this? Now, I don't know why the Protestants would do that, but it's clear that if there's a hierarchical authority in the Old Covenant, there should be one no less perfect in the New Covenant. And if that hierarchical authority in the Old Covenant was precisely in the priesthood, in the high priesthood, well, it's fitting that in the New Covenant, the hierarchical authority be in the new priesthood, the priesthood of Christ. Right, which is exactly where it is. In the fullness of holy orders, in the episcopate. And so that they don't see that, to me, means that they're not seeing the connection between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Now, it's true that the authority in the Old Covenant was unfaithful. But Christ gave a promise in the new covenant that he wouldn't allow... Peter can be unfaithful in terms of sin, but the promise of Christ is that he won't be unfaithful in terms of doctrine proclaimed with the full authority of the church. Another question. I can see how political or material intervention would alter people's situation. But how does suffering change us, especially the suffering of another? And Abelard, a medieval theologian from the 12th century, asked, why could God not just forgive without a sacrifice? All right, so there are a bunch of questions there. Let's start with the last one. Could God forgive without a sacrifice? Sure, he can do whatever he likes. God could forgive without a sacrifice. He could simply have forgiven us because he's the offended party. He could forgive us without any atonement being made. But the question is this, would that have been a perfect redemption? And I think we would say no, because it wouldn't involve us, humanity, in restoring what we took away. Right? Sin takes away the glory of God, and so it's right that we restore what we can restore. Well, we can't restore by ourselves, but that's the whole purpose of the incarnation, was that Christ became man so that he, as head, the new head of mankind, could restore what we can't restore by ourselves. And so he gave a tremendous dignity to us, an immeasurable, incomprehensible dignity of being able to restore what was taken away in our head. And so that's God treating us with dignity. Whereas if he had simply forgiven us without any atonement being made, he would have treated us, in a sense, without dignity, as incapable of participating. And that would be contrary to the purpose that he had in making us in the first place. Right? So, yes, God could have done it, but it wouldn't have been fitting for God to do it. So that would be the last one there. What about, how does suffering change us? Well, I think even in our own lives, we can see that suffering does change us. That if you look, at least if I look at my own life, and I think it's true of just about any other life I've heard about, it's precisely the great difficulties and trials of our lives in which we grow, in which we come to a spiritual maturity. Now, it doesn't always work. Sometimes great trials come our way and we don't make use of them. But normally, or at least in God's providence, the trials are intended precisely for spiritual growth. And I think just about every convert's life shows that the conversion comes through some great encounter with the cross of Jesus Christ in our own life. And so it changes us by, now that would be our suffering. Our suffering changes us by enabling us to enter into the power of his passion. Right? That's how we get converted. Some encounter the cross that we didn't plan and that we didn't want, but ended up changing our lives. And well, it's not only the old times. There's still saints in the 20th century that do things like that. We call it penance and mortification. So in the Christian life, there's a place for mortification and penance. So mortification would be voluntarily depriving us of something that we like for the sake of entering somewhat into the passion of Christ, or for the sake simply of helping us grow in temperance. It could be. And the mortification would be to deprive us, for example, that's what Lent is supposed to be, in which we deprive ourselves of things that we like so that we can be more temperate, so that we can learn to be more generous, so that we can have more compassion, etc. So we can have more self-control. And then penance would be doing that for the sake of making reparation for sin. And it can be my sin, or it can be someone else's sin. And that's what the saints do. The saints did penance like St. Ignatius, or the Cure of Ars is maybe a great example for our time. The Cure of Ars, this is the year of the priest. The Cure of Ars slept on a board a few hours a night and ate some potatoes every other day. And why? for the conversion of his parish. When he first got to this little town of ours, 300 people, he would, one of the parishioners saw him walking in the woods. Lord, convert my parish. Lord, convert my parish. And he didn't just pray. He slept on a board. He deprived himself of sleep and got up very early to go before the Blessed Sacrament to pray for his parish, etc., etc. And that is what won their conversion. Right? Jesus says this kind of demon only comes out through prayer and fasting. Fasting has different forms. But you need to do it with prudence, and it has to be in service of charity. That's what it's for. It's for charity. And so if it's done out of charity, it's a glorious thing, but you have to do it prudently. And that's why you should never take on extraordinary penances or mortifications without having a spiritual director that you consult with. Because people do sometimes imprudent things. And the great saints did imprudent things. And they ruined their health. And they wished later that they hadn't done them. So you shouldn't ruin your health, because we need our health to serve God. It's the fifth commandment. Okay. Thanks. So that's a suffering in service that can be very heroic and beautiful in service to a neighbor. And generally the best way to do those kinds of penances and mortifications is to pick things, first of all, that nobody else sees. So you never want to pick a mortification that mortifies your neighbor. Right? You don't want to say, I don't know, you're a student, I'm doing without coffee in Lent, and you fall asleep in class, or something. Or I'm fasting, and you get irritable, and you're a grouch in the family, or something. So that's one rule. And then you never want to do something that makes it difficult or impossible for you to do your duties of state, do the work that we have to do. And so the best ones are the little ones. Like Saint Therese of Lisieux talks about them. The little acts of charity, little acts of self-denial. We're irritated and we don't show it, and we show just the opposite, etc. Those are the best mortifications and penances. The little way, because we don't get inflated when we do them. We don't think we're something great, because we've gone 40 days without eating bread or something. Okay. Is this a good prayer? Lord, help me to will what you will, and to do or accomplish all that you have created me to do and be. That's a fantastic prayer, right? That's why we're here, to do what God has willed us to do, and we don't often know what that is. And so we want to ask two things. Lord, show me what is your will, and give me the strength to do it. Right? So we need two things. We need the light to see what is God's will for us. And then, that's not enough. We need the strength to embrace it with love, right? With generosity. Knowing that what He's got in store for me is what's good for me.
Yeah, instead of praying for those great graces that
right, that's
may
right.
not be ready for.
That's right, that's
or
right.
Ever be ready for.
That's right. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Please explain again. If somebody needs to leave, just feel free to leave. Please explain again the difference between Mary's ability to will Jesus' suffering and death, and Jesus' ability to will it in the midst of His suffering, especially regarding the higher and lower aspects of the soul. Well, the higher and lower aspects of the soul, the higher aspect would be what we know through faith to be the truth, and what we will to do, whether we feel it or not. So that's the higher part. What we know by faith and what we will. Because very often, what we believe and will, we don't feel. And that's okay. Because what's important isn't what we feel, but what we truly believe and what we will. And this is very important for all kinds of things in the Christian life. An act of contrition. It's not a matter so much of feeling as knowing that my sins are the worst thing in the world, and willing them not to have existed, and willing to suffer that contrition, as it were, for them. But I may not feel it. That's God's gift. Right? I can't cause myself to cry or to have tears or whatnot. It's a gift of God if we do. But so that would be the higher part, what we believe and what we will. And the lower part is what we feel in our emotional life. And so that was where Christ was doing two different... In the higher part, obviously he wasn't just believing, he was seeing. But in his lower part, he was feeling all desolation. Right? And so we should think something similar with Our Lady. So in his higher part, it is consummate. He's giving it. Into thy hands I commit my spirit. But in the lower part, he's saying, my Lord, my God, why have you abandoned me? Right? So those are the two poles. And so it would have been similar with Our Lady, I think. In her higher part, she's offering her Son. And of course, in her lower part, in her emotional part, she's utterly devastated with something that we can't imagine.
And then she has an incredible strength
Right.
to stand at the foot of the cross, not collapse.
Right, exactly. And that's very significant. She stood, right? And there's that great hymn, Stabat Mater. Right. The mother stood. And it's actually, the mother was standing. In other words, it's continuous. Right. One last question. The Protestant claim is that God punished Christ for our sin and imputed Christ's righteousness to our account. In other words, we have an imputed righteousness, and our sin was imputed to him, and so it's an exchange. He suffered, as it were, hell for our sake, what we merited, and his righteousness gets imputed to us. And this is a nominalist conception of righteousness, and nominalist in the sense that it's treating it it's not an interior transformation when we get justified. It's just simply his being imputed to us simply juridically. And so the question is, why isn't Christ taking on the sin of the world in the garden not the same kind of thing, a swapping? Is it a swapping? And so what Jesus is doing in Gethsemane is he's put himself in solidarity with mankind, and as our head. In other words, he's taken, by becoming man and becoming the new Adam, he's become our head, and he's tied to us by headship and by love, by charity. And so he takes what is ours. There is a kind of swap. There really is an exchange, and the fathers of the church speak of this exchange, this commerce, as it were. He takes what is ours, and what is that? Our mortality, and in some sense, our debt, so that he gives us what is his. And what is that? To be the Son of God, to be... he brings us into what is his, the life of the Trinity, but he takes on what is ours. And yes, that is what is due to sin. So he does do that. There is a kind of swap. But he does that precisely as our head. So he takes on what should be due to us to show us what sin is, and as we said, to offer, so for those two ends, to show us what sin is, taking on all the suffering, and to offer something more pleasing than sin is displeasing, and that would be the charity with which he suffers. And so that's not a swap there. That's something proper to him. That charity that is his alone. But he also wills to include us in that by giving us a share. That's what justification is. To give us a share in that which is his charity, his life of grace. Right? So he takes on what is ours to give us what is his. Okay? And with that, I think we should call it a night. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit.